The day my daughter asked me for $75,000, I felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. At 67 years old, I had worked hard all my life. Long hours at the diner, double shifts when money was tight, skipping vacations so that Christmas could still feel magical for her. That $75,000 wasn't just savings. It was my security blanket, the culmination of decades of sacrifice wrapped up in numbers on a bank statement. But she was my only child, my baby girl, and if she needed help, how could I say no? "Mom," she said one evening over tea in her small apartment, "it's not for me, it's for him." She glanced toward the bedroom where her husband Ryan sat scrolling through his phone, oblivious to our conversation. My stomach tightened as she explained with trembling hands how much he'd been struggling lately. Ryan had lost his job months ago, but refused to tell anyone, not even her parents, and now they were drowning in debt. He'd found a new opportunity, she swore, but he needed a truck to start working again. "He says this will change everything," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "He promises." I looked at her face, the same face I'd cradled when she was born, the same hopeful expression she wore when she graduated high school, and something inside me broke. I couldn't bear to see her suffer or watch her marriage crumble under financial strain. So, against every instinct screaming caution, I handed over the money. It wasn't just an investment in a vehicle. It was faith in their future together, faith in the man she loved. Ryan drove off in that shiny red pickup 2 days later, grinning ear to ear like he'd won the lottery. Meanwhile, my daughter hugged me tightly, promising to pay me back as soon as things got better. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my flesh and blood, and love has always made fools out of us both. But then, barely a month passed before everything unraveled. It started with little things, a missed call here, a vague text there. When I finally visited unannounced, the house felt eerily quiet. Her voice cracked as she told me Ryan had filed for divorce. Just like that. No warning, no explanation. Only a cold legal document delivered by courier, severing ties faster than either of them ever imagined. And the kicker? The truck, the very thing I'd sacrificed my life savings for, was listed as community property. As I sat across from her at the kitchen table, holding her shaking hands, I wanted to scream. How dare he do this? How dare he take advantage of her kindness, of my trust, and walk away without a second thought? But instead, I held her while she cried, rocking her like I did when she was little, whispering empty reassurances because what else could I do? Later that night, after leaving her curled up on the couch staring blankly at the wall, I lay awake in bed replaying every moment leading up to this disaster. Anger burned hotter than any emotion I'd ever known. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about betrayal. Betrayal of my daughter's heart. Betrayal of the sacrifices I'd made for her happiness. And worst of all, betrayal of the belief that people are fundamentally good. Ryan thought he'd won. He walked away with half of what we gave him, leaving behind shattered dreams and broken hearts, but he didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't know me. Because let me tell you something. A mother protecting her child is a force unlike any other. And Ryan? He hadn't seen anything yet. The days that followed were a blur of grief and disbelief. My daughter Sarah moved back into my modest 2-bedroom home, a place she hadn't lived in since college. Watching her unpack boxes filled with remnants of her failed marriage was like witnessing the dismantling of a dream I'd helped build. Each folded shirt, each framed photo placed carefully on the floor felt like another nail in the coffin of her happiness. She tried to smile through it all, but her eyes betrayed the storm raging inside. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she whispered one night as we sat together in the living room, the glow of the television casting long shadows across the walls. "I never should have asked you for that money." I reached over and squeezed her hand, forcing myself to stay calm despite the fury boiling beneath my skin. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. You trusted him. That's not something to be ashamed of." But deep down, I wanted to scream. How could Ryan have done this? How could he take advantage of her vulnerability and mine and leave us both reeling? It wasn't just about the $75,000 anymore. It was the audacity of his betrayal. He'd used our desperation, our love, against us. And now, here we were, my daughter heartbroken and humiliated, and me staring down the barrel of an uncertain future without the nest egg I'd worked so hard to save. Still, there was no time to wallow. Life doesn't pause for pain, and neither could I. Bills needed paying, groceries needed buying, and Sarah needed support. So I put on my armor, the same one I'd worn when raising her alone after her father walked out when she was 5, and got to work. One evening, while Sarah was asleep in her old bedroom, I pulled out the divorce papers she'd given me earlier that day. They were stark and impersonal, written in language designed to strip away emotion and humanity. But what caught my eye was the section detailing assets. There it was, in black and white. 2022 Red Ford F-150, community property. His name was listed as the primary owner, thanks to some loophole or oversight during the purchase process. I clenched my fists so tightly the paper crinkled under my grip. He thinks he can walk away scot-free, I muttered aloud, though no one was around to hear me. He thinks he's untouchable. And then, sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by decades of memories, a plan began to form. Not reckless revenge. Not yet, but justice. Justice for Sarah, who had given him everything, only to be discarded like yesterday's trash. Justice for myself, whose sacrifices had been exploited without a second thought. And maybe, just maybe, a little payback for the smug look on his face when he drove off in that damn truck. The next morning, I called my lawyer, an old friend named Margaret, whom I'd known since my diner days. Over coffee and cigarettes, we'd shared stories of bad husbands and broken promises. If anyone understood betrayal, it was her. "Margaret," I said when she answered the phone, "I need your help." She listened patiently as I recounted the entire story, from the loan to the divorce filing. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Carolyn," she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with anger, "this isn't right. We can fight this." Her words ignited a flicker of hope within me. For weeks, I'd felt powerless, like a pawn in someone else's game. But hearing Margaret say those words reminded me of something important. I wasn't powerless. I was a mother, and mothers don't back down when their children are hurting. Over the next few days, Margaret dug into the details of the case. She discovered that while Ryan had indeed filed for divorce, the settlement hadn't been finalized yet. This meant there was still room to challenge the division of assets, especially since the truck was purchased with funds directly tied to me, not Sarah or Ryan's joint account. It wasn't a slam dunk, but it was enough to give us leverage. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances for Sarah's sake. I cooked her favorite meals, encouraged her to apply for jobs, and reminded her daily that she was stronger than she realized. But behind closed doors, I seethed. Every time I saw Ryan's smug face flash across my mind, I felt the urge to march straight to his doorstep and demand answers. What kind of man takes advantage of a woman's generosity, then leaves her high and dry? Who does that? Then came the moment that cemented my resolve. A mutual acquaintance stopped by the house unannounced one afternoon, clutching a casserole dish like it was a peace offering. "I heard about Sarah and Ryan," she said sympathetically, setting the dish on the counter. "Such a shame. But I ran into him last week at the gas station. He looked happy." My blood ran cold. Happy? While my daughter cried herself to sleep every night? While I lay awake worrying about how we'd make ends meet without my savings? "Oh, and Carolyn?" the woman added before leaving, almost as an afterthought. "He mentioned something about selling the truck, said it was too big for him now." That was it, the final straw. Selling the truck, the very thing I'd sacrificed for, while wiping his hands clean of responsibility. No remorse, no accountability. Just greed and entitlement wrapped up in a shiny red package. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, I picked up the phone and dialed Margaret again. "We're doing this," I said firmly. "Whatever it takes." On the other end of the line, Margaret chuckled softly. Good, because I already started drafting our counterclaim. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small smile. Ryan might think he'd won, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. Mothers don't forgive easily, and they sure as hell don't forget. The days turned into weeks as Margaret and I worked tirelessly behind the scenes, piecing together a strategy that would not only reclaim what was rightfully mine, but also expose Ryan for the manipulative opportunist he truly was. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about sending a message. A mother protecting her child doesn't back down, and I intended to make sure Ryan understood that, in the most unforgettable way possible. Margaret unearthed some critical details during her investigation. First, there was the paper trail linking the $75,000 directly to my bank account, not Sarah's or Ryan's joint account, which meant it could be argued that the truck wasn't technically community property. Second, we found evidence of Ryan's financial mismanagement prior to losing his job, including unpaid debts and suspicious withdrawals from their shared accounts. While none of this proved malicious intent outright, it painted a damning picture of a man who had been reckless with resources long before Sarah came to me for help. But perhaps the most damning piece of information came from an unexpected source, Ryan's own social media. In a moment of arrogance or sheer stupidity, he posted photos of himself at a dealership, posing proudly beside the truck with a caption that read, "New beginnings start with fresh rides. Tash grateful." Beneath the photo, friends congratulated him on his new chapter, while Sarah sat in my living room, drowning in despair over the loss of her marriage. When I showed the post to Margaret, her eyes narrowed. "This is gold," she said, tapping the screen. "It shows intent. He's flaunting the very thing your savings paid for, while simultaneously abandoning your daughter. Judges hate guys like him." I nodded grimly, my chest tightening with anger. That smug grin staring back at me from the screen was more than I could bear. Ryan thought he'd won, that he'd walked away unscathed while leaving us to pick up the pieces. But he underestimated one crucial factor: a mother's wrath. With our case building momentum, Margaret advised me to stay calm and avoid any direct confrontation with Ryan until the legal process played out. "Don't give him ammunition," she warned. "Let the court do its job." Easier said than done. Every fiber of my being screamed to confront him, to march up to his door and demand answers face to face. But I knew better than to act impulsively. This wasn't just about satisfying my rage. It was about securing justice for Sarah and ensuring we didn't leave ourselves vulnerable to counterclaims. Still, staying silent wasn't easy, especially when Sarah began receiving texts from Ryan, thinly veiled attempts to justify his actions. "I hope you're doing okay," one message read. "Things just weren't working between us anymore. You know that." Another arrived a few days later. "About the truck? I'll try to send you something once I sell it. Maybe a couple thousand? It's all I can afford right now." Each message sent Sarah spiraling further into self-doubt. "Do you think he really believes this?" she asked me one night, tears streaming down her face. "That it's somehow my fault?" "No," I said firmly, holding her close. "He knows exactly what he's doing. He's trying to gaslight you, sweetheart. Don't let him." But even as I reassured her, I couldn't shake the feeling that these messages were meant for me too, a taunt disguised as conciliation. Ryan thought he could placate us with hollow promises and vague apologies, all while keeping the spoils of his betrayal. Little did he know, we were already 3 steps ahead. As the court date approached, Margaret and I met regularly to prepare our case. She coached me on how to present myself in front of the judge, calm, composed, and factual. No matter how much I wanted to unleash my fury, I had to remain professional. Emotions wouldn't win this battle. Logic and evidence would. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in my best outfit, a navy blue blazer and slacks, paired with low heels. My hair was neatly styled, and I wore minimal makeup, wanting to appear approachable yet authoritative. Beside me, Sarah clutched my hand tightly, her knuckles white with anxiety. I gave her a reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to say anything unless they ask you to," I reminded her gently. "Just let Margaret and me handle it." She nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fear. I wished I could shield her from this entire ordeal, but part of growing stronger meant facing the storm head-on. And today, we would stand together, not as victims, but as survivors determined to reclaim what was ours. When we entered the courtroom, Ryan was already seated at the defendant's table, scrolling idly through his phone. He looked up briefly when we walked in, his expression unreadable. For a split second, our eyes locked, and I saw it, the flicker of unease beneath his confident facade. Good. Let him sweat. The proceedings began with both sides presenting their arguments. Ryan's lawyer tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance, claiming the truck was essential for his livelihood and therefore justified under community property laws. They even attempted to argue that the $75,000 loan was a gift, not a debt, citing Sarah's initial reluctance to involve me in their marital issues. It was infuriating to hear them twist the truth so blatantly, but I kept my composure, focusing instead on Margaret's steady voice as she dismantled their claims one by one. She presented the bank records proving the funds originated from my account, highlighted Ryan's history of financial irresponsibility, and concluded with the damning social media post, a visual reminder of his callousness. By the time Margaret finished speaking, the judge's expression had shifted noticeably. His earlier neutrality gave way to skepticism, and I allowed myself a small glimmer of hope. Ryan's lawyer scrambled to respond, but their rebuttals felt weak and defensive, lacking the substance needed to counter our evidence. Finally, after hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge announced his decision. The vehicle in question, he said, addressing the courtroom, was purchased using funds provided by the plaintiff's mother. Given the circumstances and supporting documentation, it cannot be classified as community property. Furthermore, the court finds sufficient grounds to order repayment of the full amount to the original lender. My heart soared as the words sank in. We'd won. Not just partially, not barely scraping by, but decisively. The truck belonged to me now, along with every penny of the $75,000 I'd sacrificed. Ryan stared at the judge in disbelief, his face pale with shock. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw cracks in his carefully constructed armor. The smirk that had haunted my dreams for months was gone, replaced by raw panic. As we gathered our things to leave, I caught his eye one last time. "You should have thought twice before crossing a mother," I said quietly, my voice steady but laced with steel. "Next time, maybe you'll learn to show a little respect." And with that, I turned my back on him, walking out of the courtroom with my head held high. The courtroom victory was sweet, but it wasn't the end of the road. Winning back the truck and securing a court order for repayment didn't magically erase the pain Ryan had inflicted on my daughter, or the damage he'd done to our lives. Sarah still struggled to sleep at night, haunted by memories of a marriage that crumbled faster than either of us could have imagined. And while I tried to shield her from the fallout, I couldn't ignore the lingering bitterness in my own heart. Ryan, however, wasn't ready to accept defeat. In the days following the ruling, his desperation became palpable. He called Sarah repeatedly, leaving voicemails filled with half-hearted apologies and thinly veiled threats. "You don't understand what you've done," one message said, his voice trembling with anger. "This isn't over." When Sarah played the messages for me, I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. "He's trying to intimidate you," I told her firmly. "Don't let him." But intimidation wasn't the only weapon in Ryan's arsenal. Within a week, we received notice that he intended to file an appeal, a desperate attempt to overturn the judge's decision. Margaret assured me it was unlikely to succeed, given the strength of our case, but the mere fact that he was dragging this out further infuriated me. Didn't he realize how much harm he was causing? Or did he simply not care? One evening, as Sarah sat curled up on the couch watching television, I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. Legal battles were important, yes, but sometimes justice required a more personal touch. After all, Ryan had underestimated me once before. It was time to remind him why crossing a mother is always a mistake. I started small, digging deeper into his life to uncover vulnerabilities I could exploit. Through mutual acquaintances and social media sleuthing, I pieced together a clearer picture of who Ryan really was. A man living paycheck to paycheck, drowning in debt even before the divorce, and clinging to the illusion of success through material possessions. That shiny red truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of everything he wanted to project to the world. Power, stability, control. Taking it away would shatter that facade completely. With the court's ruling in hand, I contacted the dealership where Ryan had purchased the truck. Using the documentation proving ownership now rested with me, I arranged for the vehicle to be repossessed. The process was straightforward enough. Ryan had missed several payments since losing access to Sarah's income, making him delinquent on the loan. All it took was a single phone call to set the wheels in motion. 2 days later, I received confirmation that the repo team had successfully retrieved the truck. When I shared the news with Sarah, she looked at me with wide eyes. "Mom, are you sure about this?" "Absolutely," I replied, my tone unwavering. "That truck doesn't belong to him anymore. Let him explain to his friends why he can't afford a fresh ride after all." The next morning, Ryan showed up at my doorstep unannounced. His face was flushed with rage, his hands balled into fists at his sides. For a brief moment, I considered calling the police, but something stopped me. This confrontation had been brewing for months, and deep down, I knew it needed to happen. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Do you have any idea what you've cost me?" I crossed my arms and met his gaze head-on, refusing to flinch. "Actually, yes. I know exactly what I've cost you. A stolen truck, a shattered ego, and maybe a little bit of humility. About time, if you ask me." His jaw tightened, and for a second I thought he might lash out physically. But instead, he leaned closer, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won? You've ruined my life." "No, Ryan," I said coldly, stepping forward until we were nearly nose to nose. "You ruined your own life the day you decided to take advantage of my daughter and me. You lied to her, manipulated her, and then walked away without a second thought. That truck, that money, it was never yours to begin with. And now, thanks to your greed, you've got nothing." For the first time, I saw real fear flicker across his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed off, slamming the door behind him. As I watched him retreat, a strange sense of satisfaction washed over me. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was rightfully ours. It was about dismantling the illusion of invincibility he'd carried for so long. Ryan had spent years believing he could charm his way out of anything, that consequences wouldn't catch up to him. Today, they finally had. In the weeks that followed, word spread quickly among our small community about Ryan's fall from grace. Friends and acquaintances began distancing themselves, unwilling to associate with someone whose actions had caused such devastation. Even his family seemed reluctant to defend him, judging by the terse emails Margaret forwarded to me from his attorney. Without the truck or Sarah's financial support, Ryan's carefully constructed image of success crumbled like a house of cards. Meanwhile, Sarah began to heal. Slowly but surely, she started rebuilding her life, applying for jobs, reconnecting with old friends, and rediscovering the parts of herself she'd lost during her marriage. One evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you, Mom," she said softly, "for everything you've done, for fighting for me when I didn't know how to fight for myself." I reached over and squeezed her hand, my throat tightening with emotion. "You don't need to thank me, sweetheart. That's what moms are for." And yet, as proud as I was of how far she'd come, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this chapter of our lives wasn't fully closed. Ryan may have been defeated, but the scars he left behind would take time to fade. Justice had been served, but forgiveness? That was another story entirely. Little did I know, fate had one final twist in store, one that would force us both to confront the true cost of betrayal. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm for Sarah and me. She found a steady job at a local marketing firm, her confidence slowly returning as she rediscovered her independence. I returned to my routines, tending to the garden, volunteering at the community center, and savoring quiet evenings with a good book. On the surface, things seemed peaceful, but beneath that calm, there was an undercurrent of unresolved tension, a lingering sense that Ryan's shadow still loomed over us, even in his absence. Then, one crisp autumn morning, everything changed. It started with a knock on the door just after breakfast. When I opened it, I was surprised to find a young man standing there, an officer from the local sheriff's department. His expression was solemn, and he held a clipboard in his hands. "Miss Carolyn Bennett?" he asked, glancing down at his notes. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm here regarding a legal matter involving your former son-in-law, Ryan Carter. May I come in?" My stomach dropped. For a split second, panic surged through me. Was this about the appeal? Had Ryan somehow managed to overturn the court's decision? But then I remembered Sarah wasn't home. She'd left early for work, blissfully unaware of whatever storm might be brewing outside. Taking a deep breath, I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. The officer explained the situation as we sat at the kitchen table. Apparently, Ryan had been involved in a hit-and-run accident the previous night, driving recklessly in a borrowed car. Since the truck had been repossessed, he'd collided with another vehicle at high speed, injuring both the driver and their passenger. Witnesses reported seeing him flee the scene shortly afterward. Hours later, police tracked him down hiding in a motel room, visibly intoxicated and unrepentant. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay composed. "He listed you as his emergency contact during booking," the officer said apologetically. "Given the circumstances, we thought it best to inform you directly." I stared at him, stunned. Emergency contact? After everything he'd done, how dare he drag me into his mess again? Yet even as anger bubbled inside me, another emotion crept in, a faint flicker of pity. Ryan had hit rock bottom, and instead of facing the consequences like a man, he was clinging to the last shred of connection he had left, our shared history through Sarah. "I see," I said finally, my voice steady but cold. "Thank you for letting me know." After the officer left, I sank into a chair, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to ignore the whole thing, to let Ryan deal with the fallout on his own. He'd made his choices, and now he had to live with them. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just bad luck or karma catching up to him. This was a cry for help, however misguided and selfish it might be. When Sarah came home that evening, I debated whether to tell her about Ryan's arrest. She'd worked so hard to move past the pain he caused, and dragging her back into his chaos felt cruel. But keeping secrets never solved anything, especially between mothers and daughters. So after dinner, I sat her down and told her everything. The accident, the injuries, the fact that he'd tried to run away. Her reaction surprised me. Instead of rage or despair, she simply looked sad. "I don't understand why he keeps doing this," she murmured, staring at her hands. "Why can't he just take responsibility for once?" "I wish I had an answer for you, sweetheart," I said gently. "But some people are too broken to fix themselves, and too stubborn to ask for help." For a long time, we sat in silence, the weight of Ryan's actions hanging heavy between us. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we should visit him? Just to see if he's okay?" I blinked in disbelief. Visit him? After all the pain he'd caused us? The idea felt like pouring salt on an open wound, and yet, looking at Sarah's conflicted expression, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing someone's behavior. It was about freeing yourself from the burden of hatred. "Let me think about it," I said carefully. "We'll decide together what's best." 2 days later, we stood outside the county jail, staring up at its imposing brick facade. Neither of us had spoken much on the drive over, each lost in our own thoughts. As we approached the visitor's desk, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Was this a mistake? Would seeing Ryan only reopen old wounds? When he was finally brought into the visiting area, he looked nothing like the cocky man who'd driven off in that red truck months ago. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. For a moment, none of us said anything. We simply stared at each other across the scratched plexiglass barrier. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "I didn't expect you to come," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "Either of you." "We almost didn't," I said bluntly, "but Sarah wanted to make sure you're okay." His gaze shifted to her, guilt flashing across his features. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. For everything." She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I know, Ryan, but sorry isn't enough anymore. You need to figure out why you keep hurting people and stop running when things get hard." For the first time, I saw genuine remorse in his expression. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. As we left the jail later that afternoon, I turned to Sarah and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Are you glad we came?" I asked softly. She hesitated before answering. "I don't know if I forgive him, but at least now I know I can move on without hating him. And that's something, right?" I smiled faintly, pride swelling in my chest. My daughter had grown stronger than I ever imagined, capable of grace even when it seemed impossible. Forgiveness wasn't absolution, it was closure. And sometimes that was the greatest victory of all. As we drove home, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the fields. Life would never be the same for either of us, but maybe that was okay. We'd faced betrayal, fought for justice, and emerged stronger on the other side. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. A mother's love and her determination to protect her child could overcome anything, even Ryan.